You have reached the point where you can no longer sustain the relationship, where continued investment in someone who cannot reciprocate adequately depletes you beyond what your well-being can tolerate, where choosing yourself requires releasing someone whose patterns demonstrate they lack capacity to meet your needs despite your patience and understanding. You have completed the painful internal work of accepting that the avoidant cannot transform on your timeline, or perhaps cannot transform at all, that your hope for their change has sustained you through cycles of disappointment that teaching you clearly that hope alone cannot build the relationship you deserve. You have made the decision to protect yourself through absence, through ceasing contact, through redirecting your energy away from someone who could not adequately receive it, through building life that no longer includes space for their defended limitations. Yet doubt creeps in during moments of weakness, during times when you wonder whether your absence matters to them at all, whether someone so defended could possibly feel the loss of someone they seemed barely to notice while present. You question whether removing yourself serves any purpose beyond protecting your own heart, whether the avoidant experiences your absence as relief rather than as loss, whether their defended presentation of indifference reflects their actual internal experience. This message finds you precisely when you need to understand that your absence is not invisible to the avoidant, that your removal from their life creates effects their defensive structure cannot prevent, that the person who appeared barely affected by your presence is profoundly affected by your absence in ways their defended consciousness resists acknowledging, yet their behavioral patterns and psychological state reveal undeniably. The avoidant feels your absence with intensity that exceeds how consciously they appreciated your presence, experiences your removal as loss that penetrates defenses which successfully minimized your significance while you were available, discovers through your sustained unavailability that you mattered far more than their defended position allowed them to recognize or reciprocate adequately. Your absence creates the precise conditions where their defensive structure begins failing, where the emotions they avoided while you were present become unavoidable, where the reality of permanent loss forces recognition that temporary distance never generated. This understanding arrives exactly when you need it, not to motivate you to return to someone whose patterns harmed you, not to restore hope that the avoidant will transform now that they feel your absence, but rather to confirm that your choice to prioritize yourself has impact beyond your own healing, that your absence speaks truths your presence could never communicate, that the person who seemed untouched by your investment is deeply affected by your withdrawal, even when their defensive structure prevents them from expressing that impact in ways you can witness directly. Your absence creates the exact space where their defenses collapse. The avoidance defensive structure operates most effectively when external relationship provides target for defensive mechanisms to manage, when your presence gives their defenses something concrete to work against, when the relational dynamic supplies ongoing material, their defensive interpretations can process in ways that preserve their defended comfort. Throughout the relationship, the avoidance defenses directed themselves toward managing your presence, minimizing the significance of your care, reinterpreting your needs as pressure, characterizing your emotional expressions as excessive, positioning your investment as evidence you wanted too much. These defensive operations required your ongoing presence to function because defenses need external stimulus to defend against. Your expressions of feeling gave the avoidance defenses material to minimize. Your requests for connection gave their defenses material to reinterpret as demands. Your demonstrations of care gave their defenses material to take for granted while avoiding recognition of that care's value. Your absence eliminates the external target. The avoidance defenses evolved to manage, creating psychological void, where defensive mechanisms have nothing concrete to work against. The avoidant cannot minimize expressions of feeling you are no longer sharing with them. They cannot reinterpret requests for connection you are no longer making. They cannot take for granted care you are no longer providing. The absence of external relational stimulus means the avoidance defensive operations lose their usual function and effectiveness, leaving the avoidant without the familiar protective mechanisms that allowed them to remain comfortable in their defended position while you were present. This elimination of defensive targets forces the avoidant to confront internal psychological material their defenses existed to prevent them from experiencing directly. While you were present, The avoidant could project their internal discomfort onto the relationship. They could tell themselves they felt pressured by your needs, overwhelmed by your emotional intensity, suffocated by your desire for closeness. These projections allowed the avoidant to externalize their discomfort, to position the relationship as source of their anxiety rather than recognizing that their internal defensive structure created that anxiety. Your presence provided convenient external explanation for internal distress that actually stemmed from the avoidant's own fear of vulnerability and intimacy. Your absence strips away this convenient externalization by removing the relationship as target for projection. The avoidant can no longer blame their discomfort on your presence, your needs, your emotional expression. Yet the discomfort persists. The anxiety, the sense of something wrong, the internal unease that the avoidant previously managed by projecting it onto relational dynamics. Without external target to receive these projections, the avoidant must confront that the discomfort originates within themselves, that their defended position itself generates the anxiety they attributed to relationship pressure, that their internal psychological state rather than your behavior creates the distress they experience. The collapse of defenses occurs gradually as the avoidant attempts various defensive maneuvers to manage your absence and discovers that familiar defensive operations fail to provide their usual comfort. The avoidant may attempt to minimize the significance of your absence by telling themselves they feel relieved, that the relationship was burdensome, that they are better off without obligations intimacy created. Yet this minimization cannot sustain itself across extended absence, because the avoidant's actual experience contradicts the defensive narrative. They do not feel relieved, but rather feel emptiness. They do not feel unburdened, but rather feel loss. They are not better off, but rather worse in ways they cannot deny indefinitely. The avoidant may attempt to fill the void your absence creates through pursuit of new connections, seeking to replace you with someone who provides similar benefits without similar requirements. Yet these attempts reveal through their failure that you were not replaceable variable in equation, but rather were a specific person whose absence cannot be filled by finding someone with superficially similar qualities. The new connections lack what you provided, fail to replicate the dynamic you created, cannot fill the void your specific absence created. This failed substitution forces recognition that you mattered specifically rather than generically. That losing you represents particular loss rather than loss of abstract relationship that anyone adequate could restore. The defensive collapse becomes most acute when the avoidant recognizes they have lost not just your presence, but the version of themselves that could occasionally emerge when with you. Your presence created conditions, safety, acceptance, patience, where the avoidant could occasionally lower defenses enough to access more authentic version of themselves. Your absence eliminates these conditions, leaving the avoidant trapped more completely in defended position without the relational environment that occasionally allowed them to be less defended. The avoidant faces that they lost not just you, but lost access to parts of themselves they could reach only when your presence created sufficient safety, that your absence means absence of conditions where they could occasionally be more fully human rather than purely defended. The space your absence creates also eliminates the buffer your presence provided against the avoidant's existential aloneness. While you were present, even when the avoidant maintained emotional distance, your existence in their life provided reassurance that they were not fundamentally alone, that someone knew them and chose to remain despite knowing them, that connection was possible even if their defenses prevented them from fully accessing that connection. Your absence removes this existential reassurance. Confronting the avoidant with the profound isolation their defensive position creates when no one remains willing to bridge the distance their patterns create. The avoidant must face that their defended autonomy is not comfortable independence, but rather is lonely isolation, that their patterns prevent the intimate connection that would make their existence feel less fundamentally alone. Understanding how your absence creates space where defenses collapse requires recognizing that defensive structures operate most effectively when they have external stimuli to manage and external targets to blame for internal distress. Your presence provided both. Your expressions and needs gave their defenses material to work with, while the relationship provided convenient target for projecting internal discomfort. Your absence eliminates both functions, leaving the avoidance defenses without their usual operating mechanisms, while forcing the avoidant to confront that their internal state rather than external relationship creates their distress. This forced internal confrontation represents the precise condition where defensive structures begin failing, because the avoidant cannot indefinitely defend against internal reality when external distractions and projections have been eliminated through your complete withdrawal from their life. They feel your absence most in moments they took you for granted. The avoidant moved through the relationship barely noticing countless small ways your presence enhanced their daily life, treating your contributions as baseline expectations rather than as gifts requiring acknowledgement or reciprocation. You performed invisible labor that made the avoidant's life easier, managing logistics they would have handled alone, providing emotional support they claimed not to need, creating an environment where they could relax without conscious effort to maintain relational connection. You offered presence during mundane moments that felt unremarkable, sitting together in comfortable silence, sharing meals that required no special occasion, existing alongside each other in ways that created texture and warmth in daily life. The avoidant experienced all these elements without conscious appreciation because consistent presence fades into background, becomes expected rather than noticed, generates no particular attention precisely because it is reliably available. Your absence reveals the magnitude of what you provided through the accumulation of small moments where the avoidant expects your presence or your contribution and encounters, instead the void your removal created. The avoidant reaches for their phone to share something with you, before remembering you are not available to receive that sharing. They face minor difficulty and instinctively think to ask your help before recognizing that help is no longer accessible. They return home to empty space that previously contained your presence, experiencing the silence as absence rather than as neutral condition. They encounter something that reminds them of you and want to point it out before confronting that you are not there to appreciate the reference. Each of these small moments operates as individual realization of loss, and the accumulation of these moments across days and weeks creates psychological weight that far exceeds the impact of any single dramatic recognition. The mundane moments particularly reveal your absence because these were the moments the avoidant most thoroughly took for granted during the relationship. The avoidant may have occasionally noticed and appreciated significant gestures, the times you supported them through major difficulty, the occasions when you did something special to demonstrate care, yet the avoidant failed completely to notice or value the unremarkable everyday presence that actually constituted the foundation of what you provided. Your willingness to listen to their mundane daily experiences, your consistent check-ins that created rhythm and connection, your accommodation of their preferences in small decisions, your management of details that allowed their life to run more smoothly. All these contributions operated beneath the avoidant's conscious awareness as invisible support they never acknowledged as support because it felt like baseline condition of their life. Your absence makes visible what was invisible through the contrast between how their life functioned with you and how it functions without you. The avoidant discovers that tasks you handled now require their effort. The emotional regulation your steady presence provided now falls entirely on their limited capacity. The environment you created through your attention to details now degrades unless they maintain it themselves. Each discovery represents a moment of recognition. This is something they did that I never noticed while they were doing it. The accumulation of these recognitions forces awareness that you were providing extensive support. The avoidant took completely for granted that your presence made their life substantially better in dimensions they never consciously appreciated until your absence revealed those dimensions through their disappearance. The feeling of your absence becomes most acute during routine moments that had no particular significance during the relationship, but that your absence transforms into markers of loss. The avoidant's morning routine feels incomplete without your presence. The meal they eat alone highlights your absence more sharply than special occasions that carried explicit relational significance. The evening hours they previously spent in your company now stretch empty in ways that force awareness of how much of their daily life included you. how thoroughly you were woven into their routine existence, how much your removal has altered not just major dimensions of their life, but the entire texture of their daily experience. The avoidant particularly feels your absence during moments when they would have previously complained about your presence or about relational obligations your needs created. The avoidant remembers feeling annoyed when you wanted to process something emotional, wished you would give them space, experienced your need for connection as burden. Now, facing complete absence of your emotional sharing, complete freedom from any obligation to process feelings with you, complete space without your needs requiring any attention, the avoidant discovers that what they characterized as burdens were actually expressions of intimacy. They miss profoundly, now that those supposed burdens have disappeared along with your presence. The avoidant faces that they took for granted not just your presence, but the specific ways your presence manifested. Your emotional openness they dismissed as excessive, your desire for connection they experienced as pressure, your investment in the relationship they failed to adequately reciprocate. The mundane nature of these moments where your absence is felt most acutely creates particular psychological impact because the avoidant cannot dismiss them as temporary emotional reaction or as dramatic grief response that will pass. The absence you create permeates not just significant occasions, but every ordinary moment of daily life, creating persistent awareness that someone important is gone, that the texture of daily existence has fundamentally changed, that the person they took for granted enhanced their life in countless ways they never consciously registered until those enhancements disappeared. The accumulation of these mundane moments of felt absence generates psychological pressure that dramatic single realizations could never create, because the mundane moments repeat constantly, forcing recognition again and again that you are gone, that what you provided is no longer available, that the avoidant failed to adequately value something precious while they had access to it. Understanding why your absence is felt most in mundane moments requires recognizing that human attachment operates primarily through accumulated small interactions rather than through dramatic significant events. You build significance in the avoidant's life not through grand gestures but through consistent presence across countless ordinary moments. The avoidant took this presence for granted precisely because it was ordinary, because it felt like baseline rather than like remarkable gift. Your absence reveals that the ordinary was actually extraordinary, that the baseline you provided was actually elevated condition the avoidant cannot replicate for themselves, that the mundane moments they barely noticed while you were present were actually the foundation of security and connection your presence created. The felt absence in these mundane moments forces recognition that the avoidant lost not just relationship, but lost the entire way of living that your presence made possible. Your absence forces them to feel everything they avoided while you were present. The avoidant maintained defended position throughout the relationship, partly through using your presence as mechanism to avoid feeling emotions their defensive structure existed to suppress. Your presence provided convenient target for emotional projection. The avoidant could direct frustration toward relational dynamics rather than confronting internal sources of their distress, could blame anxiety on relationship pressure rather than recognizing their own fear generated that anxiety, could externalize discomfort by characterizing your needs as excessive rather than sitting with their own incapacity to meet reasonable needs. Your emotional availability also served as substitute for the avoidant's own emotional processing. You felt and expressed emotions for both parties. You did the work of maintaining emotional awareness and connection. You carried the relational emotional load while the avoidant remained defended against their own feeling states. Your presence particularly allowed the avoidant to avoid confronting their profound fear of abandonment and their terror of intimacy by creating situation where both fears remained theoretical rather than actual. While you remained present and available despite their patterns, the avoidant never had to face genuine abandonment. You kept returning, kept remaining accessible, kept bridging the distance their withdrawal created. While the avoidant maintained defended distance even within the relationship, they never had to face what complete emotional isolation feels like. Your presence provided baseline connection even when the avoidant remained defended, ensuring they never experience the full isolation their patterns create when no one remains willing to maintain connection they refuse to reciprocate. Your absence eliminates all these avoidance mechanisms by removing the external relationship as repository for projected emotions, and by forcing the avoidant to experience directly the fears their defensive structure evolved to prevent. The avoidant can no longer project their internal distress onto relational dynamics because no relationship exists to receive such projection. They must confront that their anxiety, their discomfort, their sense of something wrong originates within their own psychological state, rather than originating from external relationship pressure. This forced internal confrontation strips away the comfortable fiction that the relationship was the problem, revealing that the avoidant's defended internal state itself generates the distress they successfully blamed on relational dynamics while you were present to receive that blame. Your absence also forces the avoidant to feel their own emotions without you serving as emotional surrogate. While you were present, you maintained emotional awareness for both of you. You noticed when the avoidant seemed distressed, even when they denied distress. You processed relational emotional content. They avoided processing. You carried feelings about the relationship while the avoidant remained defended against feeling. Your removal eliminates this surrogate emotional function, leaving the avoidant with no one to feel their feelings for them, no one to maintain emotional awareness they avoid, no one to do the psychological work of acknowledging and processing emotional states they defend against experiencing directly. The forced emotional confrontation becomes particularly acute around the avoidance attachment needs that their defensive structure existed to suppress. The avoidant organized their defenses around denying they need intimate connection, around maintaining they are self-sufficient, around presenting themselves as unbothered by whether others remain in their life. Your absence destroys this defensive denial by forcing the avoidant to experience directly what life without intimate connection actually feels like. The avoidant discovers that they are not actually comfortable in complete isolation, that they do need connection with specific important others, that losing you creates genuine pain rather than the relief their defensive narrative predicted. This direct experience of attachment needs, they spend their life defending against forces recognition that their defensive position was built on denial of fundamental human needs their actual psychology cannot suppress indefinitely. Your absence also forces the avoidant to feel the abandonment they spent their life defending against experiencing. The avoidant's defensive structure developed specifically to prevent others from getting close enough that their eventual departure would create the devastating abandonment the avoidant fears at core level. The avoidant believed that maintaining emotional distance would protect them from abandonment pain by ensuring no one mattered enough that losing them would hurt significantly. Your complete sustained absence reveals the flaw in this defensive strategy. The avoidant did become attached despite their defenses. You did become significant despite their attempts to minimize your importance. And losing you does create the abandonment pain their defenses existed to prevent. The avoidant must feel directly what they organized their entire relational life around avoiding. The pain of losing someone important, the grief of separation from significant attachment figure, the devastation of recognizing too late that someone mattered profoundly. The avoidant also must feel their own responsibility and regret without the defensive escape of blaming relational dynamics or your supposed inadequacy. While you were present, the avoidant could maintain comfortable position where relationship problems stemmed from your excessive needs, your pressure for connection, your inability to accept their limitations. Your absence eliminates these convenient defensive targets, forcing the avoidant to confront that their patterns rather than your needs created the relationship's failure, that their defended limitations rather than your supposed inadequacy made adequate partnership impossible, that they bear responsibility for losing someone who offered them patience and understanding they failed to adequately reciprocate. The avoidant must sit with regret they cannot externalize, with recognition that they destroyed something valuable through their own patterns, with awareness that they have only themselves to hold accountable for the loss they experience. The emotional flooding your absence creates becomes overwhelming because the avoidant lacks developed capacity to process intense emotion. Their defensive structure prevented them from building the emotional regulation skills that processing feelings across time develops. While you were present, your emotional regulation provided stability the avoidant depended on without acknowledging that dependence. Your absence means the avoidant must manage emotional overwhelm without external regulation, without your steadying presence, without the support structure your emotional capacity provided. The avoidant discovers they lack tools to process what they feel, lack capacity to sit with intense emotion without defensive escape, lack ability to regulate themselves through the feelings your absence forces them to experience directly. Understanding why your absence forces the avoidant to feel everything they avoided requires recognizing that defensive structures operate through avoidance mechanisms that require specific conditions to function effectively. The avoidant avoided their own feelings by projecting onto the relationship, by using you as emotional surrogate, by maintaining distance that prevented full attachment. Your presence enabled all these avoidance mechanisms by providing external target for projection, by doing emotional work the avoidant avoided, by creating connection that prevented the avoidant from experiencing complete isolation. Your absence systematically eliminates every avoidance mechanism, leaving the avoidant defenseless against the emotions their defensive structure existed to suppress: their attachment needs, their abandonment pain, their loneliness, their regret, their responsibility for loss. The forced feeling of everything they avoided represents the precise psychological crisis their defenses evolved to prevent, and your absence creates conditions where that crisis becomes unavoidable. The absence becomes unbearable when they realize you're not coming back. The avoidant maintains psychological equilibrium during initial period of your absence through unconscious assumption that the separation is temporary, that you will eventually break your silence, that the door remains open for eventual reconciliation, even if that reconciliation feels distant or uncertain. This assumption allows the avoidant to tolerate the discomfort your absence creates by framing it as temporary condition rather than permanent loss. They can manage temporary discomfort by telling themselves the situation will change, that you will return to some form of contact, that the relationship has not definitively ended despite current distance. The avoidant psychology clings to this hope not necessarily because they consciously want reconciliation, but because accepting permanent loss would require psychological reckoning. Their defensive structure resists with all available resources. The psychological shift occurs when accumulating evidence forces recognition that your absence is not temporary positioning, but rather represents permanent departure. That you are not strategically withdrawn while remaining emotionally available, but rather have genuinely released them and redirected your life away from any future that includes them. This recognition arrives through multiple channels that converge to destroy the avoidance defensive hope that your absence is temporary. The extended duration of your silence communicates permanence through its sustained quality. Temporary strategic withdrawal lasts days or weeks, but your absence extending months or longer signals something fundamentally different. The complete quality of your unavailability communicates finality. You have not left channels partially open or maintained selective contact, but rather have eliminated all access completely. The avoidant also recognizes permanence through observing your life continuing and evolving without them. Through whatever limited information reaches the avoidant, through mutual connections, through social media if you have not blocked them completely, through chance encounters or second-hand reports. They perceive that you are building satisfying life, that you demonstrate contentment or happiness, that suggests you have genuinely moved beyond them, that you are not waiting or hoping, but rather are actively engaged with present and future that does not include them. This visible evidence that you have moved forward destroys the avoidant's unconscious assumption that you remain emotionally frozen in the relationship's aftermath, that you maintain some orientation toward them despite the distance, that your absence reflects hurt that will eventually heal in ways that allow restored connection.